Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlight Series. Today we focus on benchmark CG 3.7, in which we will explain the structure, functions, and processes of the legislative branch of government. In Part 1, we examine the processes of the legislative branch. We will examine specifically how a bill becomes a law, appointment confirmation, and committee selection, which is benchmark clarification 1. How does a bill become a law? What is the process for confirming appointees, and how are committees selected? What we're going to note is that 2 of these processes are included in the U.S. Constitution itself, and 1 of them is not. So here we see an information graphic showing us the flow of the U.S. legislative process. As you can see, the U.S. legislative process starts with an idea. That idea is a bill. A bill is a proposed law. So 1 or more members of one House of Congress introduce a bill. Now, it may be that both houses of Congress agree that that bill should be introduced, but one house is going to introduce it. Then we go through this process of examining the bill, changing the bill, that's called markup, changing the bill to make sure that everybody's on the committee is in agreement on it, make sure that the intent of the bill is in line with people's expectations. Does the language of the bill match the expectations? After a committee votes on the bill, that bill is then sent to the full House. So this is where we see an interesting difference between what the Constitution says and what is practiced within each House of Congress, but is not written into the Constitution, at least not specifically. Let me explain. In Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, the Senate and the House of Representatives are basically told that they can decide how they're going to conduct business. They can decide how they are going to meet the constitutional requirements that are included in Article 1. So imagine, if you will, there are 100 U.S. senators and 435 members of the House of Representatives. Imagine if every single one of those senators had to sit in the same room at the same time and debate and decide what would be included in a bill. That process would never end. As soon as one senator said, let's make a change to this bill, there would have to be a debate and discussion and then a vote. And then another senator might make a different change, and it would just go on forever. So one of the ways that each House of Congress utilizes its power to decide how they're going to conduct their own business is by forming committees. And committees are going to be smaller groups of people, somewhere between, say, 10 and 30 people, depending on which House of Congress. And they're going to have somewhat of a shared interest. So, for example, members of the U.S. Senate or the House of Representatives who are from states whose economies depend on agriculture are more likely to serve on committees that relate to agriculture. You also might have members of the House or members of the Senate sitting on committees that are particularly concerned about immigration policy because they are living in states and representing states that border Mexico or border Canada. So they might have a particular interest in immigration policy because those states are what we call border states. It may be that there is a particular interest based on the constituents who might live in a particular state. If there's a particular state that has a high number of higher education institutions or high population compared to other states, there may be issues that are of a particular concern, and those members will represent their states by serving on committees that are concerned with those issues. From there, because the Constitution does require that both houses of Congress agree on the same version of the same bill before it can be voted on, then that House of Congress, each House of Congress will vote on the bill, and then representatives of both houses of Congress will look at the bill together just to confirm that the versions of the bill are the same. They will hammer out or work out details if there are details that are not the same to make sure that both versions of the same are the same, and then both houses will vote on the final bill. That requirement that both houses agree on the same version of the same bill, that is included in Article 1, Section 7 of the U.S. Constitution. From there, the president then can decide. The president has to sign or veto the legislation. The president can choose to do nothing as well. But if the president signs the legislation, the bill becomes a law. If the president vetoes the legislation, then the president must send the message back to Congress as to why he vetoed the bill. If the president chooses to do nothing and there's more than 10 days left in the legislative session, then the bill becomes law. If the president chooses to do nothing and there is 10 days or less left in the legislative session, then that bill is vetoed. If a bill is vetoed when there's more than 10 days left in the session, then the president must send the message to Congress, and Congress can choose to override the bill with 2/3 of each House of Congress. But if there's less than 10 days left in the session and the president does nothing with the bill, that's what we call a pocket veto, and a pocket veto cannot be overridden. So that means that if Congress wants that legislation to go into effect, Congress has to reintroduce the bill and go through the legislative process again. Let's look at the confirmation process. What we have in front of us is the confirmation process for a recent appointee to the United States Supreme Court. The power to confirm public officials who must be nominated rests solely with the U.S. Senate. So we just looked at the powers of Congress working together. That's Article 1, Section 7. But it's actually in Article 2 where we see the confirmation process, that the president can nominate ambassadors, high-level public officials such as U.S. Supreme Court justices, and cabinet members, specifically cabinet, the heads of departments and other heads of other agencies that do require confirmation. That rests solely with what the Constitution calls the advice and consent of the Senate. So the way that the Senate gives its advice and consent is by confirming nominees, to the by the U.S. Senate that the president has made. Okay, so now we're going to look at a U.S. Senate confirmation process. This process was for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. She was a judge of the District of Columbia to be the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. And we can see that in terms of the Senate's vote, in order for the confirmation to go through, 1/2 of the senators must say yes. And here we see that there were 53 senators who said yes and 47 senators who said no. And as a consequence of this vote, Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is now a life member of the United States Supreme Court. We now look at committee selection. As I mentioned earlier, the Constitution gives the power to each house to determine how they conduct business. So here we see Article 1, Section 5. Each house may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and expel a member. So the third power that we see here is extremely rare. It is very, very rare when the Congress will expel a member. But determining the rules of their proceedings, that's the committee process. That's the legislative process when it comes to introducing bills, going through the committee process, markup, etc. It's also very rare for members to be punished for disorderly behavior. Sometimes that comes in the form of a censure, which means that a person is formally notified that they have behaved outside the rules of the chamber. And there also have been recent occasions when a person has been denied their right to serve on committees in Congress because of their behavior that was considered outside the boundaries of the rules of the Senate. So let's look at some committees in Congress. There are three types of committees. There are standing committees. Standing committees are permanent committees. They review and modify bills and decide if they should be sent to the floor for a vote. A subcommittee is a committee within a committee that is formed to tackle a specific task. And a select committee is a temporary committee set up for a special purpose. So sometimes we call these committees select committees, sometimes we call them special committees. And these are committees that may grow into standing committees if the purpose for which they've been formed is then viewed as having more long-term national impact and need. So here in Florida, there was a congressman who's now passed away several decades ago in the 1980s, but he was the chair of a select committee on aging. And that select committee on aging, this was Claude Pepper, he took different aging issues, since Florida has the largest percentage of people age 65 and over, not the largest number, but the largest percentage of people 65 and over in this state versus other states, and looked at issues as they related to health care and employment and housing and economic security. And now that select committee has become a standing committee because the issues that were raised by Congressman Pepper were those that the rest of the Congress believed required long-term focus and attention. So now we have a standing committee. As you can see from the screen, there are also significant differences in the House versus the number of Senate committees, particularly as they relate to standing committees and subcommittees. There are far fewer standing and subcommittees in the Senate than in the House, and this makes sense because there are more than 4 times as many members in the House of Representatives at 435 compared to the Senate, which has 100 members. What about committees that are shared between both houses of Congress? Well, there are joint committees, and joint committees are those committees where both House and Senate members sit to coordinate the work of both houses. So think about what we just said about the legislative process. A joint committee is going to work to make sure that as bills are going through the 2 houses of Congress, that they really are going to end up being the same. And this then saves the conference committee work after a bill has gone through all these multiple processes. So a joint committee is often there to coordinate the efforts of both houses on key issues and specific subjects, and also to help administer shared functions. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? If so, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.